We are very fortunate to have two environmental leaders, Will Rogers and Amory Lovins. Will Rogers is an influential advocate for land conservation. He has managed directly urban infill projects and now is serving as the president of the Trust for Land, which is a national nonprofit that conserves land for parks and for wilderness. And I asked him what his favorite place was, that piece of land that they had conserved, and he couldn't choose. He said, well, I have to give you two. And one is a playground in Brooklyn, and the second is the High Elks Wilderness Corridor between Crested Butte and Aspen. So come on up.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I used to hang out at the drama department and take advantage of the cafeteria here at the business school. And in those days, we didn't fraternize with the business students. So how things change. I take my hat off to Net Impact. What Net Impact is doing to bring together and to create a forum around social responsibility and corporate social responsibility, I think, is enormously important. In this room, I think where people are really focused on sustainability, the differences between for-profits and not-for-profits tend to break down. We're all working with a dual bottom line, and we're working on mission and we're working on economic return. And unless we handle both the numbers and the social benefit, we don't get to keep doing what we're doing. So thanks for letting me share some thoughts about how land conservation fits into the larger sustainability issue, and how TPL and others, some in the business sector, some in government, are what we're doing to ensure sustainable land use. And finally, I want to suggest some key leverage points that I believe will help all of us working with these two bottom lines. Now, you'd have to be pretty blind to understand why land use and other land conservation issues have become so popular and so contentious over the last decades. Although we have a ways to go, our water is cleaner, our air is clearer, but what is happening on our landscapes, particularly on the urbanizing edges of our cities, is the burning Cuyahoga River of these decades. With 80 million more people by 2030 and a projected total of 450 or 500 million by the end of the century, population pressure is increasing even as we squander our land with a dispersed, low-density, car-oriented, consumptive land use pattern. So how does the trend play out? Well, between 1970 and 1990, the land area of Metro Los Angeles grew by 300%. The population grew by 45%. During that same 20-year period, the land area of Metro Chicago grew by 49%, while the population grew by only 4%. We're developing, paving over about 3 million acres a year right now. That's an area the size of Connecticut, and that's before a lot of these new population pressures. So that's the challenge. Those are some of the numbers, but it's just for context. I'm really not here to talk about problems. We hear a lot about the problems. I'm more interested in solutions, and really that's what this conference is about. Let me give you a brief outline of the Trust for Public Land and what we do as a market-based land for people conservation organization. We're a nonprofit. I often refer to us as undevelopers. That is that we develop green infrastructure. We develop the unbuilt environment, parks, playgrounds, and open space. We have a deal-oriented culture that sits in a very interesting sweet spot between the for-profit and not-for-profit communities. We use our market-based real estate tools to deliver three services: green printing, or what we call conservation vision, finance, and deals. We've done small and large conservation implementation plans for communities and for regions, helping them identify what they want to see 50 years from now, and then helping them figure out which lands to set aside and how to go about protecting them. When it comes to conservation finance, since 1995, we've helped create about $25 billion worth of public conservation funding across America for parks, for open space, and for watershed protection. And on the deal side, we do each year about $500 million worth of transactions, and that includes zero or negative value vacant inner city lots to tens of thousands of acres of wilderness land and everything in between. We got 400 people stretched over 40 offices, so we're stretched thin. And unfortunately for those of us in management, our entrepreneurial credo is that it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. It's the job of our offices to bring national resources, tools, and experience to bear on local conservation challenges with local partners. So I believe that effective and meaningful land conservation, including protecting our fellow species, whether they're charismatic or nondescript, can only happen when we focus on people and on communities. And that means creating or setting aside the places and resources on which our physical, economic, community, and environmental health are based. And more, as we conservationists wrestle with the problems of population and of inappropriate land use, we see a blurring of the boundaries that separate land conservation from public health, housing, economic development, transit, energy use and policy, and urban design. The many aspects of where and how we live are inextricably related and inextricably tied to how we use our land. Now, based on my belief that people are at the heart of the solution for sustainable land use, I'm going to share observations on what I think of as 3 key success factors that drive the work that we do in conservation and which I believe are applicable to other sustainability challenges. And they are harnessing the market, leveraging deeply held personal values, and working where people are, in cities. First, the market. Now, when it comes to land use, there are regulatory tools like zoning and planning, and there are market tools. And while they're both critical and intertwined, TPL and the larger land trust community have a business model that focuses on the market rather than on policy and regulation. So we end up competing for land with the development community. And hopefully, we're influencing that community. As a former developer who made his living doing real estate deals in cities, I find it particularly satisfying to use the power and the tools of the market to keep land that shouldn't be developed from being paved over. I was asked to speak about how TPL and others like us work. So here are a few examples of projects that demonstrate how we work in the market. Last year, we completed the final phase of protecting about 170,000 acres of timberland at the top of New Hampshire, containing a series of lakes in the headwaters of the Connecticut River. Now, acting as a conservation investment banker, TPL brought in 6 key partners and a variety of funding sources. We structured the deal with the owner, International Paper, to achieve multiple conservation and social benefits. Those included protecting a core of 25,000 acres of lakes and wetlands that should never get logged or ever get developed for second homes. It included keeping inappropriate development off the balance of that land, retaining timber jobs in the surrounding communities, and guaranteeing public access and sustainable timber management. We tied up the $35 million property with a $12 million loan from a preferred partner, a terrific organization on the for-profit side, Lime Timber. Lime is a private, conservation-friendly, and socially responsible timber management and investment company. We then put together a funding package and brought in the Nature Conservancy to bridge finance the key 25,000-acre resource lands until they could sell those later on to the state of New Hampshire. And then we worked with the state, with the federal government, and with private donors to come up with a funding so that the state could buy the development rights on the remaining 145,000 acres to keep it as a sustainably managed buffer for the Connecticut River headwaters. Finally, we sold the restricted fee to Lime Timber and retired their loan. So at the close of the deal, none of the land could be developed. The most important resource lands, that 25,000 acres, were fully and permanently protected. They couldn't be logged. Lime Timber was able to purchase good timber without paying its development value and provide excellent returns to their investors while committing to manage their timber according to FSC sustainability standards. And to the relief of the local community, mill jobs were preserved, and residents could hunt, fish, hike, and snowmobile on property that would never be developed. Now, that project, while on the larger and more complex side, is typical of what nonprofits can do in working with business and with government. There are plenty of other examples and models where we've used the tools of the real estate and the finance industries. A while back, we did a debt for nature swap on 11,000 acres in San Diego, which was in default on its bank loan. We bought the non-performing loan secured by the ranch at a deep discount. We refinanced the loan with a rancher, bailing him out, taking land in return for our fee, as well as a long-term option to buy up more land for conservation. That enabled the rancher to continue to own and ranch the land while we slowly but surely found the funding to buy up the balance of the ranch for its critical habitat and Native American historical sites. We've been working on it for 10 years. I think we're on phase 27B right now. But it's happening. In other instances, we partially developed by ourselves, and I use the word developed, by ourselves or in joint venture or sold for development with strings attached. A number of sites, including a ranch outside of Austin, a valley in eastern Washington state, a small portion of a 3,000-acre coastal property not far west from here. And as a conservation organization, partnering with developers can be politically challenging. We're often accused of going to the dark side. But we see it as a great opportunity to harness the marketplace, to tap into private capital where public funding is unavailable. And it also allows us to demonstrate the happy integration of the built and the unbuilt environment. Now, let me be clear that we're very realistic about the importance of working with and encouraging good development. Until we come to better and more consistent local and regional planning and zoning, the development community is arguably going to have a far greater impact on what happens on our landscapes than the Trust for Public Land or the Nature Conservancy or the 1,500 land trusts in America. The better our partnerships and the more accessible we can make the enlightened development, the better chance we're going to have a country in 30 years from now that we want to live in. Now, as we push the conservation envelope, sometimes people push on us. Last year, we were approached to enter a partnership to create green cemeteries around the country, where we would identify and hold easements on scenic land in need of restoration next to state and federal parks. The burials would be low impact with little trace, and a portion of the funds from plot sales would go into restoring the land into parks and then generally supporting conservation. We liked the idea, but we took a pass on the opportunity. Cemeteries don't fit into our core competencies. We've done a number of carbon sequestration deals. One on the last known habitat of the ivory-billed woodpecker in Louisiana, where bottomland hardwoods were completely leveled for soybean fields, which ultimately didn't work. We bought the cropland, planted it with bottomland hardwoods to restore that habitat, and sold carbon credits to an energy company for enough money to make our purchase pencil out, to offset the planning costs, and to provide a small per-acre stewardship fund for the Fish and Wildlife Service to whom we sold the land. Now, the credits went for $2 a ton, which is what they were trading at, I think, on the Chicago Climate Exchange. At that time, on the London Exchange, where Kyoto is a factor, credits were going for about $20 a ton. But when your focus is on people and land, you can find yourself in a number of strange situations. For most of last year, we were the proud owners of the Cypress Gardens amusement park in Winter Haven, Florida, you know, the Southern Bells and the water skiing thing. After the park closed its door, the state of Florida came to us and said, is there some way that you can protect the botanical gardens and also help us get this thing going again to protect local jobs? We bought the land, worked with the state of Florida to put a conservation easement on it. We were able to lower the price then of the land to an owner-operator who we found, who was subsequently reopened and re-energized both the community and really created a wonderful and vital economic area, and subdivision has been avoided. So there are plenty of other opportunities to do market-based conservation, especially as philanthropic or traditional public funding gets scarcer. I think some of our best opportunities will clearly involve partnership with real estate and other corporate partners who are increasingly becoming more enlightened about land use. I want to close this topic with a caveat. Using the marketplace has plenty of advantages, but there are also some disadvantages. The just buy it approach to conservation and as a growth management tool isn't going to work, I don't think, in the long run. The critical raw material is money. There's never going to be enough money to really get a good balance between the environment and development. California, for example, has about a $12 billion backlog right now of much-needed parks and habitat and watershed protection. Another challenge is that the marketplace has limited vision, believe it or not. Even with the early progress in corporate social responsibility, the market is focused on the next quarter and not on the next generation. Real vision is going to come from real people guiding the markets, not from the invisible hand doing the right thing every time. Market solutions often relieve us of the hard choices between what's best for the individual and what's best for the community. And in many places, those choices are not being made correctly when it comes to what happens on our lands. And finally, I would say that the marketplace approach is very reactive. Emergency room land conservation, as I often call it, because money's easiest to raise when there's a threat. It's hard to use market-based conservation to get out ahead of growth. In too many places, we're staying just ahead or just behind of the bulldozers. And as a result, we're often treating the symptom, not the underlying cause, which is poorly planned and unsustainable land use. My second success factor involves leveraging deeply held personal values. In fact, I thought about calling this talk Value and Values. What a difference an S makes. To say that people tend to have big feelings about land is an understatement. Now, while the market may treat the land and its resources as a commodity, it was conservationist Aldo Leopold who in his land ethic urged us not to think of land as a commodity, but as a community of which we are all members. And from that membership, according to Leopold, comes our personal and community identity, our health, our sense of history, our patriotism. In a minute, I'll mention a corresponding set of values about how we should use and regulate or not regulate land, and how these two groups of values are sometimes in conflict. Now, how do we know that people care about their changing landscapes and the loss of special places? They're taxing themselves to do something about it. A year ago, Americans voted decisively to spend $3.5 billion more to protect natural areas and neighborhood parks. Of 161 conservation measures nationwide on November a year ago's ballot, voters approved 120, or 75%. Now, while the presidential election didn't turn on environmental issues, voters still sent a very strong message that the environment matters. Red states and blue states alike voted green when it came to parks and to open space. Now, this wasn't unusual. Since 1996, when TPL's Center for Conservation Finance first started keeping track, this country has passed 1,130 conservation finance measures. 77% of all such measures which get onto the ballot pass. And that's yielded about $30 billion for parks, for open space, and for watershed protection. I don't know of any other issue that gets such consistent support. And it doesn't only happen in the densely populated states where people are aware of what's left, like New Jersey and Florida. Last month I was in Gallatin County, Montana, outside of Bozeman, to celebrate their local land conservation program. Now, I get to do this a lot, but my guess is that the people in the group that we're celebrating aren't used to celebrating land protection. It's a very, very conservative community there, and property rights rule. But there was plenty to be excited about. 40 square miles of private land under conservation easement over the last 2 years. There were ranches, many of them along the upper Gallatin River that had been protected, and all in the path of Bozeman sprawl. It's hard to think of Bozeman as sprawling, but it's doing it. The ranchers who sold conservation easements to Gallatin County were not well-heeled fly fishermen ranchers. These were working ranchers. They'd been on the land for generations, and they were willing to sell their development rights to the county to preserve their land and their community as they knew it and loved it. They donated the majority of those easements. They were proud of what they'd done, and they were eager for others to follow suit, hence the celebration. The money was there because Gallatin County voters, a conservative red county, if ever there was one, voted 4 years before to tax themselves for $10 million to protect their local landscapes. And yes, there was distrust at first that those easements would mean, what those easements would mean. You know, what control the government would exert, you know, the black helicopter idea. But it just took one visionary rancher to take the plunge, and others lined up shortly thereafter. And a year ago, the county voted for another $10 million open space bond. This example is very relevant for how we deal with growth in America. In the presidential election of the year ago, 97 of the 100 fastest growing counties in America voted for George Bush. So that's a sure sign that we need conservation models and strategies that are acceptable both to conservative politics and values, and arguably based in the market. But the big feelings are there. The words at the Gallatin celebration reminded me of what rancher Bill Gay in Steamboat Springs of Colorado once told me about how he and his family feel about the ranch that they ranch outside of Steamboat Springs. Bill said, "Our love of this land has us by the throat." In the polling we do across America, the one-on-one conversations, the examination of what goes on in the voting booth, Americans are telling us that when they vote to tax themselves and create parks and to protect open space, these are the values that are driving their decisions. A profound sense of respect and caring for nature, seen by many as God's creation. Responsibility to our children and to future generations. The sense of place and home, and the patriotism, their words, patriotism, that comes from our relationship with the land. Fairness and social justice, and the belief that everyone should be able to experience the wonder of nature and a healthy contact with the natural world. The sense of freedom and independence and inspiration that comes in nature, particularly remote and wild nature. A sense of community, and last but not least, beauty. Now, many voters also cite the other set of land use values, that conservative set of land use values, and those are honoring property rights, voluntary non-compulsory programs, democratic enactment, it's got to go to a vote, accountability, efficiency, and high leverage. So we need to be sure that both sets of values are on the table when land use decisions are made. Environmentalists and conservationists have been accused of spending more time on science and regulation than on communicating these basic human values. And I think that's a fair criticism. There are two things we've got to do if we're going to truly leverage values and people's connection with their land and with their communities. First, we need to make sure that we are measuring what matters, and then we also need to learn to tell the stories that capture and share those values with others. Now, one challenge for any business, particularly relevant with this conference, that goes beyond the financial bottom line is to find metrics that measure the right things. We've learned over time that if our commitment is to land and people, then measuring our success in acres and dollars just isn't enough. We need to be measuring the impact of our work. Smiles on kids observed in playgrounds, fresh vine-ripened tomatoes from a protected local farm, pounds shed or spirits lifted walking or running on a trail. 5 years ago, we started to augment our traditional measurements, and we've made some progress. We're now experimenting with a system that allows us to rank and to evaluate the qualitative, intangible benefits of our work, so that if, for the sake of discussion, we can only do 250 transactions a year that looked at through the lens of our mission, we're sure that those are the 250 best transactions with the greatest potential impact on people and on land. We're also learning to tell a different kind of story. No longer just the project manager as hero story told around the coffee machine or the water cooler, although they're often great stories. We're telling more stories that convey deeply held human values and community heroics, can-do stories, stories of hope, not despair, stories where communities, nonprofits, business, and government come together to make a difference. And if it means that in addition to all of the other hats that conservationists have to wear, we've also got to become storytellers, well, so be it. My final point is about where conservation and other social activities need most to happen. If you really believe in land and people conservation, as we do, healthy people living sustainably in a healthy landscape, then there is no more important place for us to be working than in and around our cities. That's where most of us live. That's where the voters are who can protect nature out there. That's where we can use parks and nature to help create not just a livable, but a lovable alternative to runaway suburban growth. And that's where you can find a whole generation in danger of losing its connection with the natural world. Now, when we talk about nature and open space in cities, we aren't just talking about Central Park or Millennium Park or Golden Gate Park or the other crown jewels. A city is only as healthy as its poorest and most overlooked neighborhood. So we need to focus on equity and fairness and a park system where every urban resident can walk to a neighborhood garden or park or playground. every resident. The city of Maywood in Los Angeles County is a case in point. It's the densest city. Most people don't even know about it. It's very small. Densest city west of the Mississippi. 1 square mile with 32,000 inhabitants, most of them poor, Hispanic, and young. Now, Los Angeles has an average of about 8 acres per 1,000 people. That's generally how cities measure their park density and investments. The minimum urban recommended amount is about 10 acres per 1,000. The white population in Los Angeles has about 32 acres per 1,000 residents. And Maywood, well, I can show you what Maywood has. This is what Maywood has per resident. Now, you add it all up, and it comes up to about 1/4 of an acre per 1,000 people. So it's about 2% of the recommended average. So Los Angeles has some serious work to do with its park equity. In Maywood, I once watched, and it's a treeless neighborhood, I once watched 2 kids fighting over the shade from a utility pole. We get surprised regularly in New Jersey, where we've been working with schools in Newark and Camden to refurbish school playgrounds and getting the kids involved in the design process. We've come across kids who have never actually seen a functioning swing set. So there are some serious inequities in this country. Most children in Maywood have no Playwood, hardly. Most children in Maywood have no place to play. They have what one author calls nature deficit disorder, having little or no connection with the magic and wonder of the natural world. They're not likely to be tomorrow's conservationists. Author Robert Michael Pyle has a relevant quotation. Those who care conserve. Those who don't know don't care. What is the extinction of the condor to a child who has never known a wren? How do we know about Maywood? Well, we mapped it. Part of our Parks for People program in Los Angeles was to use GIS mapping technology to greenprint LA County and understand where the parks are and where the people are, particularly the highest number of low-income families and children, because they're the ones with the least mobility. Where kids have no place to play, and believe it or not, 2/3 of kids under 14 in Los Angeles can't walk to a local park or playground. That's where we look for opportunities to recycle land to create parks and gardens. And that word recycle is important, because if you're working from inner city to wilderness on conservation, you're talking about protecting pristine places out there that we don't want to lose. When you're working in the cities, you don't have pristine places. You're working with contaminated sites, former industrial areas, abandoned lots, whatever you can get your hands on to repattern our cities to make them more livable, particularly in our low-income communities, which conveniently often happen to have the most blight and brownfields, which can be converted. They're not happy about it now, but if we can do that conversion, it will make a big difference. In Maywood, the opportunity was a toxic site along the cement channel that many refer to as the Los Angeles River, next to a railroad line, a street, and a warehouse. The solution was to create a partnership where we brought in the city of Los Angeles, the EPA, and the business and community organizations to assemble a 7-acre park site. And although our funding source was from the city and through the EPA, in other respects it was a very traditional brownfield redevelopment. We got control of the abandoned site, 37 underground storage tanks with solvents and other unsavory liquids. Thanks to a completely committed group of people at the EPA who really wanted to deal with blight issues, there was an emergency procedure that actually cleaned up the site, so it was enormously helpful. We negotiated the abandonment of both the rail line and the street, bought the warehouse, leased it out for cash flow while we were putting the assemblage together, and then brought the community and the partners together for a collaborative park design process. And when the park is done, Maywood will have doubled the amount of parkland that it has. And also, the community will have learned through this project that it has a surprising ability to make good things happen. On a larger scale, last Tuesday, the Atlanta City Council approved a $1.5 billion tax assessment district. If the adjacent Fulton County approves their part of the district, Atlanta will begin to create an emerald necklace of parks around the city, 22 miles long. It's a loop. It runs through 45 neighborhoods. It has the potential of completely transforming Atlanta. And it is an opportunity both for economic development and for parks equity. It's called the Beltline. We didn't think of it, but we figured out a way to create a vision and implement it that got Atlantans on board. And now that the mayor has adopted the vision, She sees both the economic development and the park's equity opportunities. So we've settled back into our development role of doing an assemblage. We're out $15 million right now before there's any certainty of a takeout. But if we don't get involved right now and take the risks, by the time the T's are crossed and the I's dotted on the assessment district, the development community, which already gets what this is going to do for Atlanta, will have snapped up all the land, and there won't be anything left for the parks that they're hoping to leverage for their developments. So you got to get out in front sometimes, and that's an important role of a nonprofit as opposed to government. There are other things going on in urban conservation that should help to make our cities part of a holistic solution to America's land use and sustainability problems, and make life better and more meaningful for city dwellers. I've given you a few examples of where and how land conservation nonprofits are working in partnership with other sectors. I don't know if this country will rise to the challenges that stand between us and a healthier, more responsible, and more sustainable relationship with our land and our environment. I don't know. But I can tell you that stories like these and gatherings like this strengthen my hope for both community-based land conservation and for the American society. I've no doubt that by embracing that dual bottom line of mission and economic return and harnessing the marketplace, we can make desperately needed progress towards sustainability and quality of life for everyone. So let me close by saying thank you to all of you, each of you, wrestling with how, in your own way, you can make the world a better place. Thanks.
I come from another of that rare breed of independent entrepreneurial nonprofits. You might think our mission is quite different than what Will has just described. We create abundance by design. More precisely, we foster the efficient and restorative use of resources to make the world secure, just, prosperous, and life-sustaining. But we do it in the same trans-ideological way that Will has described. And I think we share a great deal of philosophy and tactics across the considerable difference in our missions and activities. Raymond Williams apparently wrote, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing." And I ran across another nice one the other day from St. Francis of Assisi, who reputedly said, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." If really necessary, I guess use PowerPoints. So I'd like to talk about our biggest piece of work so far, winning the Oil Endgame, which went up 14 months ago on oilendgame.com, where you can download the book, as probably 500,000 folks have done so far, and all of its technical backup. So far, nobody's argued with it. It's an independent, peer-reviewed synthesis, co-sponsored by the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of Naval Research, and written around competitive strategy cases for the car, truck, plane, and oil industries and around military requirements. It was written, therefore, for business and military leaders, not for politicians. They can hear about it in due course from their constituents. And it has an arrestingly simple thesis that by sometime in the 2040s, the United States can get off oil altogether and strengthen its economy, all led by business for profit. This is a familiar theme in economic history. It's about the substitution of resources as innovation flourishes. In 1850, one of the biggest industries in the U.S. was whaling, and millions of homes were lit by whale oil lamps. But as whales got shy and scarce, the price of whale oil went high enough for long enough to elicit competitors, two of which proved fatal, oil and gas, both made at the time from coal. And in the 9 years before Drake struck oil in 1859, over 5/6 of the whale oil lighting market went to those competitors. The whalers were astounded when they ran out of customers before they ran out of whales. because they hadn't been paying attention to the competition. They were soon reduced to begging for federal subsidies on national security grounds, and the remnant whale populations were saved by profit-maximizing capitalists and technological innovators, later including Edison 20 years later with the electric light. Now, oil feels like this today because we've spent decades accumulating a backlog of very powerful ways to save and substitute for oil that no one had bothered to add up before. And they turn out to add up to more than enough to save all the oil we use cheaper than buying it at half today's price if its externalities are worth zero. Now, there are two big externality reasons for wanting to get off oil, both of which our analysis values at zero. We know that zero is the wrong number, but it's a conservatively low number. One is a nest of security issues. 2/3 of Saudi oil flows through one processing plant and two terminals, the larger of which has already been attacked twice. The geopolitical rivalry, especially with China over who gets the oil, has been in the open for 2 years. Price volatility of oil continues to trigger every major recession since '73 and buffet the economy. There are new concerns about oil depletion. The peak oil argument, I think it's actually a distraction. Nobody can know who's right about peak oil because 94% of the oil is owned by governments. Their economic geology is not audited by the SEC, and they have every incentive to lie about it. But it doesn't matter who's right about how much oil at what cost is in the ground, because we ought to do the same things anyway just to save money. And if we get off oil earlier than we turned out to need to, the worst that can happen is we make more profit sooner. That's okay. It's just like why we shouldn't argue about climate science. It doesn't matter who's right about that, because we should do the same things anyway to save money, namely efficiency is cheaper than the fuel it saves. More on that in my Scientific American article in September. The other big set of externalities is around the precariousness of core sectors of our manufacturing economy, automaking being the most obvious current example. And it's not just healthcare and steel costs and Japanese and European and Korean competition. Next comes China, which in June '04 announced that 5 years from now it'll be a major net exporter of cars to the world market. But China does not plan to export your uncle's Buick. Because 3 weeks later, the same cabinet passed a visionary framework for energy policy based on strong energy efficiency and leapfrog technology. America is the intended leapfroggee. I asked a well-placed friend in Detroit recently how long it will be before you can drive home from Walmart in your new Wally made by Shanghai Automotive and using very little oil, and he said, about 10 years. After that, China intends to be the world leader in fuel cells using no oil at all. They have the smart electrochemists to do it. That's why they're now the world leader in lithium-ion batteries. Brains are evenly distributed, one per person. So our choice in this country is whether to continue to import efficient cars to replace foreign oil or to make efficient cars and use neither the cars nor the oil. And ideally, of course, stop subsidizing and mandating sprawl so we have less of it and you can already be where you want to be and not need to go somewhere else. We haven't assumed any of that good stuff in here. This is all about technology, but of course, if we also had more sensible land use patterns, we would save even more oil. Now, in order to avoid these externalities, whatever they're worth, and make a lot of money, we need to do broadly two things. One is to save half the oil by redoubling the efficiency of using it. We've already doubled oil productivity, GDP per dollar, since 1975. We can double it again at an average cost of $12 per saved barrel in $2,000, levelized at 5% real. The other half of the oil we can replace with advanced biofuels and save natural gas at an average cost of $18 a barrel. So let's see, the average of 12 and 18 is 15. So that's a lot cheaper than buying the oil, assuming the externalities are worth zip. And the official forecast is that oil will be priced 20 years from now at $26 a barrel. And doing this stuff instead of buying that oil would be $70 billion a year cheaper net. Now, in order to do that, we need to invest $180 billion, half of it to retool the car, truck, and plane industries, half to build an advanced biofuels industry. What we get for that investment is 1 million new jobs, 3/4 of them in rural and small town America, 1 million jobs we can save in industries like automaking, a gross financial return of over $150 billion a year if oil is priced at $26, and a 26% reduction in CO2 emissions as a free byproduct of the profitable oil savings. Obviously, the financial returns are ample to attract private capital to this venture. However, if you want it to happen even faster with higher confidence in ways that manage risk and expand choice, it would be nice for public policy to support, not distort, the business logic. So we've come up with ways to align policy with the business logic that do not require taxes, mandates, subsidies, new federal laws, or anything else that either political party doesn't like. That's pretty neat. So one need not go to the sausage factory. This can all be done administratively or at a state level, but fundamentally it's done by the private sector for its own reasons. To give you a little historic perspective, if you look at the use of and imports of oil to the United States since 1950, you find they keep heading towards the northeast corner, except in this remarkable period from 1977 to 85. In those 8 years, GDP rose 27%. Oil use fell 17%. Oil imports fell 50%. Oil imports from the Persian Gulf fell 87%. They would have been gone in one more year if we'd continued that. And because the U.S. and others bought so much less oil, it cut OPEC's exports 48%, and it broke their pricing power for a decade. We had more market power than the OPEC cartel, but ours was on the demand side. We were and we are the Saudi Arabia of negabarrels, and we can save oil faster than they can conveniently sell less oil. So we can rerun that old play all over again, only better, and that's good because that was practice. This is real. You are here. And we have a choice whether to keep those curves going in a bad direction or to turn them around through technologies and policies that capture the $12 a barrel doubling of oil productivity, and then we turn those curves steeply downward with technologies and policies for advanced biofuels and save natural gas, and we're heading at that point off oil altogether with a lot of options for alternative supply, as I'll describe. Now, obviously, the nub of the problem is the transport sector. It's about 97-98% fueled by oil, and it uses 70% of our oil. But it turns out you can triple the efficiency of cars, trucks, and planes with extremely low cost, and also there are attractive big savings in other areas of transport, ships, boats, trains, buses, and so on, as well as in buildings and industry where typically very large savings reduce the capital cost of the facilities. And we know this in our own practice. We've lately redesigned upwards of $20 billion worth of stuff, and this is generally true. I want to focus particularly on the cars and light trucks because those are most familiar. These photos are of 4 carbon fiber ultralight concept cars done from 1991, GM in the upper left, through Toyota lower left last year. And some of these have remarkable properties, like this diesel hybrid carbon eco speedster from Opel can do 155 miles an hour and 94 miles a gallon, although not simultaneously. But the big surprise is that the ultralighting that doubles the efficiency of these platforms is free because it's paid for by simpler automaking and a smaller propulsion system to move something so much lighter, as I'll explain in a minute. So let's dig into that a little. The standard assumption about light vehicles, borrowed from economic theory, not from engineering practice, is that if cars are going to get a lot more efficient, they have to be costly, small, sluggish, unsafe, or ugly, and you wouldn't really want one. So then the only argument is about, does the government intervene to induce you to buy one anyway via efficiency standards or fuel taxes? That's the source of durable political gridlock. But what if instead we could make cars very efficient as a byproduct of integrative design? to redefine market expectations so people buy the car because it's better, not because it's efficient, just the way you probably all buy digital media instead of vinyl phonograph records. And then you've done an end run around the political gridlock, and the automakers are better off because they only need to worry about whether they make better and cheaper cars, not about random variables like oil price and public policy. Now, to see how to do this, we need only look at the physics of a car. A typical car gets only an eighth of its fuel energy actually delivered to the wheels. The other 7/8 is lost on the way to the wheels. It's lost in the engine, idling, driveline, and accessories. Moreover, of the 1/8 of the fuel energy that does reach the wheels, half of it goes to heat the tires and road or heat the air that the car pushes aside, and only the last 6% actually accelerates the car and then heats the brakes when you stop. And since 95% of the mass you're accelerating is the car, not the driver, less than 1% of the fuel energy ultimately moves the driver. After 119 years of devoted engineering effort, this is not very gratifying. But 3/4 of the fuel use is caused by the car's weight, and every unit of energy you can save at the wheels will save an additional 7 units of energy you don't need to waste getting it to the wheels. So obviously there's huge leverage in making the car radically lighter weight. And if you make it the same size, there are broadly 3 ways to do that. You can use fairly expensive light metals like aluminum and magnesium. You can use new ultralight steels, or the strongest and lightest solution, you can use carbon fiber reinforced polymer composites. That's what this $500,000 handmade Mercedes SLR McLaren is made of. And it happened to get T-boned by a Golf, which was totaled. All that happened to the carbon car is that it popped off a side panel, which they pop back on and they'll fix the scratch later. But more interestingly, if you look under the hood of that McLaren, you'll find a couple of this long carbon fiber crush cones weighing a total of 0.4% as much as the car, but able to absorb its entire crash energy hitting a wall at 66 miles an hour. Oh, by the way, are there people here who would like me to use international units? Okay, I'll do both then, and not just the Burmese units. As you know, in this country, we're moving towards the metric system inch by inch. So the reason that you can get such extraordinary crash performance is that these new materials can absorb 6 to 12 times as much crash energy per kilo as steel and can do so more smoothly, thus using the crush length up to twice as effectively. So this solves the safety riddle. Now we can make cars that are big, which is protective and comfortable, without also making them heavy, which is hostile and inefficient. Therefore, we can save oil and lives and indeed dollars at the same time. Henry Ford, told us a long time ago that you don't need weight for strength. If you did, of course, your bicycle helmet would be made out of steel, not carbon fiber. But this was a big shift in the thinking of automakers, and it's happened recently with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, with some help from its friends, basing the future light truck efficiency standards on size, not weight. So now there will be an incentive to decouple the two using light but strong materials. And the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times reported and editorialized, respectively, on 28 September that this is the new reality, that you can make light cars that are also safe, contrary to what they've been telling us all along. Now, the problem is then cost. How do you migrate these advanced materials from military and aerospace applications to automaking, which requires 1,000 times higher volume and lower cost? I got encouraged about this in the mid-'90s when I met a young engineer at the Skunk Works where they make the not quite impossible military aircraft. And he had just led the design of a fighter plane that was 95% carbon, 1/3 lighter, but 2/3 cheaper, because it was designed from scratch for optimal manufacturing from carbon, not metal. And this was considered so weird he couldn't find a customer, so the project team was disbanded, and in due course I was able to hire him to do the same thing for cars, which we did, working with a couple of European auto engineering firms to design your basic quintupled efficiency, uncompromised mid-sized suburban assault vehicle, which would pay back actually in a triple efficiency gasoline hybrid version in 2 years at today's U.S. gasoline price, or 1 year at the European or Japanese price. This is what the physical show car looks like. We have a complete virtual design for it done 5 years ago that is uncompromised and production costed. And this is for a mid-sized SUV that can carry 5 adults in comfort, up to 2 cubic meters of cargo. It weighs 857 kilos, which is 53% less than a normal steel SUV that size. But the simulations say that you could run it into a wall at 56 kilometers an hour, 35 miles an hour, with no damage to the passenger compartment. Or you could run it head-on into a steel SUV twice its weight, each going 30 miles an hour, 48 kilometers an hour, and still be protected from serious injury. The original version was 114 miles a gallon, 3.6 liters per 100 kilometers, and 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in 8.2 seconds. We later gave it brisker acceleration, this is 2.1 liters per 100 kilometers with hydrogen, and the later design would do 3.6 liters per 100 kilometers with a Prius-like gasoline hybrid powertrain. That's the one that would pay back in 2 years. Now, it can, of course, look like whatever you want. The particular styling we used for the illustrative design is what's called in the trade an active outdoor lifestyle Gen X, Gen Y crossover vehicle. If you were to fold down the rear seats, you'd find it quite cavernous inside. In fact, it's got a bit more interior space than a Ford Explorer. If you fold down the right seats instead, you could put in 2 kayaks and 2 people. It steers and controls with either a right or a left side stick, and then if you're British or Japanese, you put them on the right side. Virtual display, everything by wire, all functionality and software. Think of it like a computer with wheels, not a car with chips. All a Java embedded virtual machine running on one CPU. Sony PlayStation 10, way cool. Thanks for the help from Sun Labs. Now, what's more interesting is how it's made. That ultra-strong passenger cell protecting the people with optionally a little aluminum front subframe to drop in the traction components with whatever traction system you want. That safety cell is all made of 14 parts, and like an airframe, it's suspended from rings rather than built up from a tub, which is our legacy of the horse and buggy days. But each of these parts can be easily lifted with no hoist. Each one requires one low-pressure die set to make. Normal steel car bodies have 10 to 20 times as many parts, each with an average of 4 high-pressure steel stamping die sets. So you just saved a factor of 40 to 80 on the number of tool sets needed. Also, these composite parts snap together precisely for gluing like a kid's toy. So you just got rid of the robots, jigs, and welders. You basically got rid of the body shop, and if you lay color in the mold, you got rid of the paint shop. Those are the 2 hardest and costliest parts of making the car. So the capital intensity is at least 2/5 lower than the leanest plant in the industry, and the plant's also 2/3 smaller. Therefore, the risk-reward profile is quite the opposite of what we're accustomed to with automaking. And it's a classic disruptive technology. If you see this coming, the smart thing to do is to sell your steel stamping equipment rapidly to your competitors to slow them down. And we're making quite rapid progress in moving these materials to market. BMW announced 5 years ago, when they showed this concept car made of carbon, that it would take them about 5 years to get it into series production, and they're working hard on that already for practice, making quite a number of carbon roofs and hoods and saying quite ungermanic things on their website about the materials. Honda and Toyota have meanwhile set up carbon airplane businesses and put their best automotive innovators in charge of them. Why would they do that? Perhaps it's not all about airplanes. I'd share and to declare an interest own about 0.1% of a little number 4 spinoff from our nonprofit that has a patented magic gizmo that first, like a digital inkjet printer, puts carbon fiber plus half as much nylon or other thermoplastic into a kind of plywood called a tailored blank, and you can put the fibers in exactly the positions, layers, and orientations you want. And then you heat it up with some Wendy's heat lamps, and the nylon gets soft when you heat it. That's why it's called thermoplastic. And then you put it on a hot die and form it to the net shape you want, cool it off, and a minute later you have your finished part with almost no scrap. So I couldn't bring car parts because they're too big to fit in the airplane bin, but here's a backpack frame made this way. You want it to be very rigid end to end to transmit load to your hips, but then you want it also to be very flexible that way and this way, and we do that just by the orientation of the fibers. You can control strength and stiffness independently in different directions. If you want to use a very fancy high-temperature, ultra-tough resin called PEEK that's used in aerospace for things like stealth fighter landing gear doors where it takes stone strikes and you need something tougher than metal. You see, plastics have changed a lot since The Graduate film in the 60s. You can do even better, but even with the nylon, we can get 80 to 100% the performance of hand layup aerospace composites at a fifth the cost, and therefore beat metal. And this tiny company is already selling samples and small pilot runs and development services to 5 automakers and tier 1s. This is a seat bucket, for example, that Johnson Controls, which makes 2/5 of the world's car seats, had in the Detroit Auto Show last January as the core technology in its new concept seat. Now, if you take the cost data from our SUV design, because we put it out anonymously to bid to the supply chain at about a 500 line item level of detail when we were designing it, then you can actually figure out what it would cost to get various levels of efficiency. Now, there are, of course, incremental technologies that would add $1,000 or several $1,000s to the sticker price to save maybe a quarter to a half of the fuel, as the Academy told us, or as others told us less conservatively. But the Academy did not look at ultralighting or hybrids, even though hybrids were already on the market. They said this is too futuristic to worry about. Now, meanwhile, Toyota's Mod 2 Prius started off with about a $4,000 extra price if they had not shaved their margin because it's a hybrid, and they said they're cutting that in half over the next 3 years with volume, which in Toyota speaks means they did it already. But rather than just incremental Academy mobiles, we could take a Prius double efficiency powertrain and put it in an ultralight. So then you'd get a light truck or a car. Look at the car, because it's what's roughly comparable to the Prius, maybe a little bigger. And that would actually get almost twice the efficiency at no extra cost. It's not going up and to the right as we expect for neoclassical supply curves. It's going straight across to the right. In other words, the reason that SUV would cost $2,500 extra at the dealer is that it's a hybrid, not that it's ultralight. The ultralighting is free. This whole right-hand end of the design space, the ultralight area no one had looked at really, does not cost extra because it's paid for by the simpler automaking I just described and by needing a 3 times smaller propulsion system. So you save money on that too. Or if composites were not ready for prime time, you could always take an ultralight steel autobody that the steel industry has developed, stick a hybrid in it, in 3 years you're there, and then get most of the same savings at a roughly comparable cost-benefit ratio. So that'll be a very worthy competitor, and the market will sort out which materials win. My personal bet, although I'm materials neutral, would be on the composites because of their strategic advantages in manufacturing. But it's nice to have a conventional backup technology because everyone knows how to make cars out of steel. Well, if you add up all of the saving potential and ask how many dollars you must pay or get paid, in the case of feedstocks, to save so many million barrels a day, you find that the incremental technologies in red that the Academy talks about, the 10 or 15-year-old stuff, can save a quarter of the oil at an average cost of $6 a barrel. Or the more advanced stuff I've just described in the case of cars can save half the oil at an average cost of $12 a barrel. That's a better deal because if you actually save only a quarter and you try to do the other 3/4 of the job with supply-side substitution, some of them get too expensive. So it's better to buy half your solution in efficiency. And you can do that without any further invention, just with the best technologies in or entering commercial service last year. Now, on the supply side, there are two main elements. One is advanced biofuels. I do not mean by that conventional corn ethanol that uses 7% of U.S. corn to make 2% of the gasoline. It's expensive, it's small, it's heavily subsidized. Instead, I'm talking largely about cellulosic ethanol made from woody, weedy plants like switchgrass and poplar that can be grown in these large quantities without needing cropland or irrigation or other inputs. And you get twice the yield with less capital cost and up to 8 times better net energy yield than corn ethanol. And then you have some feedstock left over to displace petrochemicals. To illustrate the maturation of the biofuel sector, Brazil already has replaced a quarter of its gasoline with sugarcane ethanol, which had to be subsidized initially, but now it does fine without subsidy, and they've gotten the subsidy back 50 times over from their oil savings. In fact, they already can land this ethanol in New York at $1.14 a gallon, and it has 70% as much energy per gallon as gasoline does. And that's after they pay a 100% tariff, which the U.S. illegally imposes to protect its corn farmers and no doubt its ADM campaign contributions. Because of that tariff, Brazil is instead gearing up to export the ethanol further to Japan and China, where they can capture more of the rent. But the reason the ethanol competes in Brazil is it has to because there are no captive customers. That's because over half their new cars are total flex. That is, they can burn anything from pure gasoline to pure ethanol or any blend in between. So you drive up to the pump and there are lots of different offerings, and you just buy what looks cheaper per kilometer that day. So competition really works. Europe, although less of an agricultural power than the U.S., made 2 years ago 17 times as much biodiesel as the U.S. made as part of a deliberate strategy to move farmers from temporary subsidies to durable revenues, and over half that biodiesel is now distributed by oil companies. The other part of the supply side substitution is saved natural gas. We are told that U.S. gas consumption will go up due mainly to, or supplied mainly by those costly, controversial, and vulnerable liquefied natural gas, or LNG, terminals. That is, imports. However, the people who do that will lose their shirts, deservedly, because at a small fraction of the cost, half the gas in the country can be saved. The biggest saving is actually in making gas-fired electricity, because it's made so inefficiently that if you save 1% of the electricity in the country, including peak hours, you thereby save 2% of total natural gas consumption and reduce its price by 3 or 4%. Huge leverage. And the main reason we don't do that is that 48 of the United States, all but California and Oregon, reward utilities for selling you more electricity and gas and penalize them for cutting your bill. If that sounds as dumb as a possum, it's because it is, and we should stop doing it. Easy to fix. And then you can save some more gas directly in buildings and industry, although in our consulting we've never gotten results as bad as this 5-lab study shows here. And you can save some more in refineries and petrochemicals. And when you get all through, you saved half the gas at a cost at least 15 times less than the recent spot price. So here's how the pieces fit together. Instead of needing 28 million barrels a day of petroleum products in 2010, we could save 8 of those in 2025 rather. We could save 8 of those by then and be in the process of saving another 7 as we gradually turn over vehicle stocks through efficiency costing $12 a barrel. So we would need 20 instead of 28, and we could get 6 of that from biofuels and biomaterials, almost 2 from the no-brainer substitutions of saved natural gas that make sense at any relative price. There's about 8 of forecast domestic production, not counting areas now off limits, offshore and Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and so on. And we'd need about 5 from somewhere else. Where would we get it? Well, there are lots of options. For example, maybe we should buy more efficiency because we're only paying $12 a barrel for that to save $26 oil. Or maybe we should wait a little longer and get the second half of the efficiency that isn't quite done by then. Or we could continue to import some oil from Canada and Mexico, or we could let in the Brazilian biofuels. No doubt WTO will have made the tariff go away by long before 2025. Oh, I haven't yet accounted for the rest of the saved natural gas. We only used part of it here. Most of it's still left and could be directly substituted for 5 million barrels a day of oil. Or if we decided to make it more profitably into hydrogen, which can be used much more efficiently, then that would be enough to displace the domestic oil as well, all from saved natural gas. Or I haven't counted other stuff, like just unused land in the Dakotas that's very windy could support enough wind power to make enough hydrogen cost effectively to run every highway vehicle in the country at these levels of efficiency. And there's other stuff too, but you get the idea. We have a pretty rich menu to choose from. And the hydrogen option is indeed optional. It is not necessary to our conclusions, but it can happen a lot faster with those super efficient vehicles, because when you have an 857 kilo SUV, let's say half normal weight, with low drag and low rolling resistance, it takes only a third the normal power to make it go. Therefore, it can cruise at 89 kilometers an hour on the same power to the wheels that a normal SUV uses on a hot day to run the air conditioner. Yes, we also have an air conditioner, but it's 7 times more efficient than normal. So that means that the hydrogen storage required to drive 530 kilometers, normal driving range, fits in these little tanks, which are very safe off-the-shelf tanks, a third the normal size. So there's no storage problem, and you don't need any storage technology changes or breakthroughs, as is often claimed by people who forgot that you can make the car more efficient and therefore ready for the hydrogen. You see, these tanks are small enough to package or fit well with lots of room left for people and cargo. Also, the fuel cell, this little thing here, gets 3 times smaller, so you can pay 3 times more per kilowatt for it. So you reach that price point many years earlier. How many? Well, on normal assumptions, like an 80% experience curve, you would need 32 times less cumulative production volume to reach that price point. That's a whole lot of years. Or if you look at it numerically, the small fuel cell in that SUV, much smaller than with other fuel cell concept cars that have been shown, would cost correspondingly less, whatever you want to assume fuel cell systems will cost, and it drives further. Again, because the car is so light and slippery. So getting the platform physics right is really important, and the first automaker to go ultralight will win the fuel cell race. That's a big deal. You might think oil companies might not be best pleased by this prospect of a world that doesn't use oil, but in fact, in the front of our book, you'll find quotations from the heads of large oil and car companies saying that is right where we're headed. And indeed, one of the 2 forwards to our book is written by the ex-chairman of Shell, Sir Mark Moody Stewart, the other by George Shultz, the ex-chairman of Bechtel. Indeed, many, including Alan Greenspan a couple of weeks ago, have remarked that oil will probably become uncompetitive even at low prices before it becomes unavailable even at high prices. Or as Sheikh Yamani, the former Saudi oil minister, famously said, the Stone Age did not end because the world ran out of stones. The oil age will not end because the world runs out of oil. In other words, it will be the whale oil story all over again. The whale oil lighting did not end because the world ran out of whales, but because we came up with better and cheaper ways to do the same thing. So dino juice is going to be good for holding up the ground. It will not be worth extracting. Meanwhile, biofuels can be a good transitional product line. In fact, Shell is the world's largest seller of biofuels right now. And there are compelling arguments for shifting to a solutions economy business model where an oil company, say, would actually sell access and mobility services, and the less fuel it takes to get you where you want to go, the more money you and they both make. Aligned incentives are good. But you might think they'd be really worried about, gee, in a world that doesn't buy oil, what happens to the value of our oil assets in the ground? Because oil companies do own 6% of the world's oil. The others are owned by governments. Well, it turns out that the hydrogen in their hydrocarbons will probably be worth more without the carbon than with the carbon, even if nobody pays to keep carbon out of the air. This is because hydrogen can be used 2 or 3 times more efficiently in a fuel cell than hydrocarbons can be used in an engine. And therefore, if you own a hydrocarbon, you'll probably make more money taking hydrogen out of it in a reformer than putting hydrogen into it in a refinery. They're starting to figure this out. There's a big player I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the Pentagon, which is bigger than the GDP of Russia, and whose research has already transformed our economy. They did, after all, invent things like the Internet and the global positioning system and the modern microchip industry and the modern jet engine industry for military purposes. So as my wildcatters have been drilling in the Detroit Formation and discovering a new Saudi Arabia down there, we've also been helping the Pentagon figure out that they have a very serious problem of the cost and risk of fuel logistics. That's moving fuel to the platforms that consume it. Half the people and a third of the budget of the Pentagon, roughly, move stuff around. This is called logistics. 70% of the tonnage they move is fuel. Why so much fuel? Well, because, for example, an Abrams tank gets half a mile a gallon. Actually, the last oil-fired aircraft carrier got 17 feet per gallon. And why does the tank get such low efficiency? It's not just because it weighs 68 tons, but also because of some other design problems caused by the assumption in design that fuel costs $1 a gallon. Well, they forgot to count logistics because they don't do activity-based costing. It turns out the cost of delivering the gallon to the tank averages about $130 in Iraq, or if you're in a hurry, about $600 a gallon. If you knew that, you would design the tank very differently. And those costs do not include the divisions of people trying to guard those who are delivering the fuel, and that's more divisions of people. Every Abrams tank is trailed by 2 unarmored tank trucks full of fuel. Guess which one the bad guys shoot at? And there are times when the field commanders are counting the days to when they run out of fuel. So this is a serious problem of cost and risk and a big tail-to-tooth ratio and a lot of other issues that go to the heart of military transformation. So the Pentagon is very interested in going to much more efficient platforms designed according to delivered fuel price. But that means going to these light but strong materials, and that in turn means that, just as with the Internet, etc., the Pentagon's research could be driving the transformation of the civilian car, truck, and plane industries in a way that leads the nation off oil so they needn't fight over the oil. Neg emissions in the Gulf, mission unnecessary. This is a big deal. It means a world that wouldn't be fighting over oil, a more robust domestic economy, rebalancing trade and development and diplomacy. Imagine, for example, being able to treat countries with oil the same as countries without oil, or trying to regain some moral high ground by not giving others any reason to believe that everything this country does is about oil. So our military would become more capable warfighters, but we would need to do a lot less of that, and military professionals really like that idea. Now, there are 4 basic market failures we need to address to make all this happen, and the first one we don't actually need to address, even though many economic theorists of the sort who lie awake nights worrying about whether what works in practice can possibly work in theory would tell us that that is all we need to do and essential. And that is the underpricing of oil, cheaper than bottled water. It turns out there are more effective ways to have the same effect as high oil taxes, although in this country our political leaders seem to prefer for OPEC to tax us rather than to tax ourselves. But as you'll see, there are other ways to deal with the pricing issue. But we do need definitely to deal with the other market failures that come from customers taking a very short view of saving energy and not knowing much about how to do it. And indeed, the additional problem that in the large organizations making the things that use most of the oil, like the auto industry, managers, particularly middle managers in classic fashion, actively resist disruptive innovation and are comfortable with incremental sustaining innovations like another cup holder. This is all straight out of Clay Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma. So how do we turn those stumbling blocks into stepping stones, particularly in speeding the adoption of advanced technology vehicles? The most effective way we found is called a fee-bate. That is a combination of a fee and a rebate. When you go to the dealer to buy a new vehicle, and you know what size you want, within that size class there will be more and less efficient offerings. So we'll charge a fee on the less efficient ones and use the money to pay a rebate on the more efficient ones, thus broadening this price spread in a way that arbitrages the spread in discount rate between the private buyer with an implicit discount rate upwards of 60% real and society, where OMB says the right number is 3-point-something%. Well, if you do that, the practical effect will be that the private vehicle buyer will look at the whole life cycle, all 14 years' worth of fuel savings, not just the first 2 or 3 years. So the private buyer will make a societally efficient decision, but the automakers also make more money this way, as they're starting to figure out. We have a big problem in this country that many of our low-income citizens cannot afford personal mobility, even at the old gasoline prices. So my team came up with some creative ways of financial engineering that let a low-income household get into a very reliable, new, efficient car that they can afford to run. And it comes bundled with price-hedged gasoline and insurance and so on. But for every car so financed, we're going to scrap a clunker to clean up the air faster, and the combination creates a new million-car-a-year market that Detroit was never going to get otherwise, because these were not credit-worthy customers who could ever buy a new car, and they're going to make money on every unit, so they like that idea. Governments buy a lot of civilian vehicles, and if we're smart, we buy the most efficient ones and speed their market adoption. There are other ways we can do that and reduce innovators' risk. And in fact, since we pay automakers a lot to innovate, why don't we pay them through a competitive mechanism analogous to the X Prize and get the juices flowing? You know, $1 billion prize for the first one to sell 200,000 of those great SUVs. In the case of heavy trucks, it's an arrestingly simple problem. There's a 60% IRR to the hauler to triple truck efficiency. It doubles their margin, and they didn't do it. Why not? I was curious about maybe they didn't know they could do it, so I called up the heads of 2 very large clients of ours who each buy 1% of the heavy trucks in the country and said, did you know you could do this? They said, no. That's interesting. The truck maker said we could just save 1/10 of the fuel and it would cost a lot. How do you do that? So I told them, and the basic answer we got back was, well, let's build one and test it, and if it does what you say, we'll tell the truck makers that's what we want. That's the right answer. So we started facilitating conversations between them and their suppliers, and it didn't take long to discover the first 25% saving is free. That truck will be on the road in a year or so. But then the CEO said, that's not good enough. I want to invest for a return. What can you do for me? And now they're arguing about whether they'll get 15 or 18 or 20 miles a gallon. They currently get 6-odd. And I can now tell you, because it went public 2 weeks ago, who this is. That particular company is called Walmart. And this is doubling their truck efficiency with tripling then in view, is one of the remarkable energy and environmental and social goals that they announced 2 weeks ago. And there are several other large companies in an informal consortium. Now, in the case of, so we intend to flip that industry to tripled efficiency through demand pull. In the case of the legacy airlines, they just can't afford, being broke, to buy the efficient new planes that could do about half the job of digging them out of their cost hole. So if philosophically you feel, which you may or may not, that one ought to try to do something about this, a good way to do it would be federal loan guarantees for that specific purpose, offset by equity warrants, so there's no net cost to Treasury. But for each efficient new plane so financed, we should scrap one of the inefficient planes parked in the desert. The least efficient fifth of the fleet is parked. And if those ever come back in the air, they will waste a lot more oil and block the purchase and development of more efficient new ones. So the inefficient parked planes are worth more dead than alive, and we should take them out back and shoot them. Boeing likes this idea. I've already emphasized the importance of military R&D, or science and technology as they call it. The stakeholders have already agreed on some measures to enable automakers with weak balance sheets, which is all of the U.S. Big Three, to retool and retrain, again without net cost to Treasury. There are ways to speed the transition from hydrocarbons to carbohydrates and to get out of our own way, for example, in aligning utility with customer incentives. Now, by these measures, the transition in the stock of cars and light trucks can be speeded, so instead of having inefficient cars forever, the official forecast says that new light vehicles will get half a mile a gallon better in the next 20 years than they were in 1987. What are they smoking? We could jump right over the incrementally improved phase and go directly to the ultralight hybrids, or even better ones, and save almost $400 billion at the pump if oil is $26 a barrel. Now, big changes have happened quickly before. In the 1920s, it actually took automakers only 6 years to go from wood to steel auto bodies. And at the start of World War II, it took them 6 months in a real mobilization to switch over from making 4 million cars a year to making the jeeps, trucks, planes, munitions, and so on that won the war. I'm not calling for that sort of a mobilization. Maybe I should be. But if you just rely on markets for a normal, spontaneous shift in technology, it normally takes about 12 to 15 years to go from 10 to 90% adoption in the stock. And the policies I've suggested would get to that 10% takeoff point about 3 years sooner. It is encouraging that the last time we paid attention to oil, we were cutting oil intensity over 5% a year, equivalent at a given GDP to saving a Gulf's worth of imports every 2.5 years. And as a reality check, if 20 years from now every car and light truck on the road were only as efficient as the best hybrids in the showroom last year, that would save twice the oil we now get from the Gulf, or a sixth of all the forecast oil use. That doesn't sound very hard, and I'm sure those 2004 models will look pretty antique 21 years later. So I've outlined in brief how to turn these curves around from rapid increases in use and imports to headed down with $12 a barrel efficiency, adopted about 2/5 slower than we did the last time we paid attention, and turn them down more steeply with saved natural gas and advanced biofuels. Just for illustration, I showed here also an optional 10% slice of hydrogen. It would take 2 of those to get rid of the equivalent of all our oil imports sometime in the 2030s. And once you embark on that kind of substitution, you're inexorably headed off oil altogether sometime in the 2040s. Now, there are many reasons you might wish to do this. You may be concerned about national security, ours or others, or about prices. Wouldn't we love to see those prices again? Or about jobs, or about the planet, or about your grandchildren. But it seems to me whatever it is you care about and whatever your political inclinations, this is an endgame that we should together be playing to win. And I want to thank you in advance for your taking up this responsibility and opportunity.